the book that he's brought out. I also had a little bit of association with the case that's been made because I did present some economic analysis because he'd asked me and I emailed to him what economic analysis could be done of investment in India and whether it was relevant because the courts were saying that this is really something that would be missing if Mauritius Treaty and other such treaties were abrogated. Now the question is that when we are looking at the book, what would the book do for an economist? I teach economics. It would support the kind of cases that have been made by many economists in India regarding the process of globalization, and especially because this process of globalization is a process of marketization. In other words, markets are penetrating into various social spheres. For instance, Gary Becker, in his analysis, suggested that marriage is an institution which is a market institution of gains and losses. And Mr. Shivkant Jha begins his analysis by arguing that Homo economicus is now the dominant theme. And that is what I think the economists have been analyzing. When we begin to think of the process of marketization, the issue is, as Samuelson said, markets depend on the dollar vote and not on one man, one vote. And therefore, markets are not democratic institutions where one man, one vote counts. It is the purchasing power of the individual that matters in the market. So if I have $1 million in my pocket, I have 1 million votes. If I have $1, then I have 1 vote. So therefore, naturally, markets will undermine democracy. As markets advance, societies retreat. This is a natural outcome. And therefore, what we find is that Homo economicus is increasingly adopted by us in our day-to-day lives. And the second aspect of globalization that is very important is that capital has begun to dominate like never before. Why is it that the Uruguay round of negotiations came in 1986 and not before, where the new issues were introduced, as Mr. Jha has pointed out, is because there was a Soviet Union which acted as a counter check and balance to the capitalist forays that began with the Bretton Woods institution, which Mr. Jha mentioned. As soon as the Soviet Union weakened, what happened was that the capacity of the Soviet Union to provide an alternative to the developing world also decreased. And that is why America, which very clearly stated that they want to capture the agriculture market of India and of China. If you talk to Mr. S.P. Shukla, he'd make it, because he was the ambassador at that point of time, he's pointed that out in his reports. So trade and services, TRIPS, TRIMS, GATS, etc. were introduced in the Uruguay round of negotiations because the West was very clear that now the developing world cannot go to the Soviet Union and draw support. So what has happened is that in this globalizing world, the capital has begun to dominate. Capital is making the developing world countries compete against each other. Therefore, capital is extracting large amount of concessions. So it has got mobility for capital, but not mobility for labor. And mobility for labor is resisted in the WTO and other forums. It is said that that is not something that the WTO would look at because that comes under the immigration rules and not under these rules. So in other words, the point is that with marketization, the domination of capital, it is quite natural in the international fora that we will see that the international finance capital will dominate over policy making in the developing world. And what Mr. Jha has done is point out repeatedly that this kind of thing is dominating, whether it's in the parliamentary fora or in the courts. Courts have also implicitly adopted this process that marketization is a natural consequence, and therefore the judgments are based on this process of marketization that is penetrating. Then what else does this do? The process of marketization based on Homo economicus is resulting in an international division of labor where you have a situation where all clean technologies, advanced technologies are located in the West and all polluting technologies are located in the developing countries. As a consequence, where do you have the worst kind of production, for instance ship breaking, where do you have lead acid waste recycling, hospital waste recycling? Of course in China, India, Bangladesh and such countries, not in the West. Where is nuclear waste being, or attempts are being made to store nuclear waste which will last for 20,000 years in the developing world. So there is an international division of labor. That's a natural consequence of the kind of process of marketization that we are witnessing. So in other words, what Mr. Jha has done is provide a lot of support to the kind of arguments that economists have been making regarding marketization, regarding globalization. So the problem is not globalization. The problem is the present phase of globalization is based on marketization. And it is based on what the dollar vote that Samuelson said, which results in the marginalization of the marginal. So an average Indian is $500 per capita of income compared to an average American at $40,000 per capita of income. One American equals 80 Indians in the market. And therefore, India's voice does not count. India's contribution to the world GDP is only 1.5%. The US contribution to the world GDP is 23.6%. And therefore, in the World Forum, America counts, not India. And therefore, in the World Forums, America is able to dominate. So in other words, all these things are being illustrated by the kind of argument that Mr. Jha has made. And I think there is a synergy between economists and lawyers which is very essential. And that synergy comes out in this book and perhaps will actually be advanced further. Maybe if Mr. Jha now writes an epilogue to the epilogue, because in the epilogue which I have read, he said he does not want to make statements. But there he's had expressed hope that how the CAG, the parliamentarians, the economists would reform themselves. But actually, they're not going to reform themselves because it is the market whose philosophy has been internalized, whether in the parliamentarians or the judiciary or the academics or the economists. Now, therefore, the epilogue should really look at the process of rethinking democracy. And I'm reminded of the yesterday's function where Professor Rajni Kothari's book was released on rethinking democracy yesterday in the same forum in India International Center. And the real need is to rethink the kind of democracy that we will have in the globalizing world where markets are beginning to dominate and society is in the process of recession. Unless society once again begins to dominate over markets, we will be in trouble. And I think that would be the epilogue to the epilogue